In 2025, Dr. Guido Necki-Ruscone stood in a laboratory at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, staring at a genetic sequence that shouldn't exist. The DNA came from a woman buried in Hungary around 370 CE. Her grave was extraordinary. Gold crescent earrings, ceremonial placement, artifacts that screamed steppe warrior elite. But it was her skull that made archaeologists pause. It was elongated, artificially deformed in infancy, a practice associated with the most feared conquerors in European history, the Huns. For 1600 years, history told us the Huns were Mongolian invaders who swept out of Asia and brought Rome to its knees. Every textbook, every documentary, every historian repeated the same story. Asiatic hordes, Mongolian features, Eastern conquerors. But when Necki-Ruscone's team extracted this woman's genome, and everything changed. She wasn't Mongolian. Her genetic markers traced to the Central Asian steppes, Kazakhstan, the Tian Shan Mountains, regions thousands of miles west of Mongolia. Even more shocking, her DNA revealed a direct genetic link to the Xiongnu Empire, an ancient nomadic confederation that ruled Mongolia 3 centuries before the Huns appeared in Europe. This wasn't an isolated case. The study analyzed 370 individuals across 800 years, from the Mongolian steppe to Central Asia to the heart of Europe. And what they found shattered the greatest historical lie ever told. The Huns weren't who we thought they were. They weren't even a single people. If you're fascinated by hidden histories revealed through ancient DNA, hit subscribe, because this story gets even stranger. The woman with the elongated skull was buried with honors, and she was Hun nobility. But her journey to that grave began 300 years earlier, 4,000 miles to the east, in an empire that history almost forgot. That burial wasn't an exception. It was a warning. Because when scientists analyzed more graves across Hungary, Romania, and Poland, they found something impossible. Dr. Zofia Rach from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest led the archaeological analysis. Her team examined dozens of so-called Hun burials from the 5th and 6th centuries. Elite warriors, chieftains, women buried with gold and silver. The DNA results were shocking. There was no such thing as a Hun genome. One burial showed pure Eastern European ancestry. Another had Iranian genetic markers. A third carried Central Asian steppe DNA. A fourth showed a mix of all 3. Some had traces of East Asian ancestry, but most didn't. Sirach's conclusion was radical. DNA and archaeological evidence reveal a patchwork of ancestries, pointing to a complex process of mobility and interaction rather than a mass migration. The Huns weren't an ethnic group. They were a political confederation, a military alliance of tribes with wildly different origins who united under a single terrifying name. This discovery contradicts everything we thought we knew, because unlike the Avars, who arrived in Europe 200 years later with strong East Asian genetic signatures that persisted for generations, the Huns showed almost no genetic continuity. Dr. Johannes Kraus, director of archaeogenetics at the Max Planck Institute, put it bluntly, "The population of the Hun realm in Europe was genetically highly heterogeneous, and we do not find evidence for the presence of larger Eastern or steppe descent communities." Think about that. The most feared empire in Europe, the force that brought down Rome, that sent entire civilizations fleeing in terror, wasn't even a real people. They were a name, a political identity, a terror that existed in the minds of their enemies more than in their blood. They conquered half of Europe. But genetically, they were nobody. So where did this ghost come from? And why did everyone believe the lie for 16 centuries? The answer begins 300 years earlier, in a place historians almost forgot to look. Around 100 CE, the Xiongnu Empire collapsed in Mongolia. For 3 centuries, they had been the dominant power on the eastern steppes, fierce rivals of Han Dynasty China. But after devastating military defeats and internal fractures, the empire splintered. Chinese chronicles record that the Xiongnu scattered. Some submitted to Chinese rule. Others fled north into Siberia. And some, according to ancient texts, migrated west. In 1757, French scholar Joseph de Guigné proposed a radical theory. The Xiongnu didn't vanish. They became the Huns. For 250 years, historians debated this. Some supported it based on linguistic similarities between the names Xiongnu and Hun. Others rejected it, pointing to the massive gap, 300 years and 4,000 miles, between the fall of the Xiongnu Empire and the appearance of the Huns in Europe. No archaeological evidence bridged that gap. No written records traced the migration. The theory seemed like speculation. Until 2025. Necki Ruscone's team used a cutting-edge genetic technique called identity by descent analysis, IBD for short. This method identifies long DNA segments shared between individuals, proving they inherited those segments from a recent common ancestor. When they compared the genomes of Xiongnu elites buried in Mongolia between 200 BCE and 100 CE with Hun period individuals buried in Hungary between 370 and 450 CE, they found something extraordinary. Direct genetic links, not vague ancestry, not distant populations, direct genealogical connections. 2 Xiongnu individuals buried in the largest imperial terrace tomb ever discovered in Mongolia, symbols of the highest elite, were the direct ancestors of several 5th century Hun individuals buried in Hungary. Necki Ruscone's words are worth repeating. It came as a surprise to discover that a few of these Hun period individuals in Europe share IBD links with some of the highest-ranking imperial elite individuals from the late Xiongnu Empire. The genetic modeling showed a split time of approximately 500 years, exactly matching the gap between the late Xiongnu period and the Hun period in Europe. The Xiongnu didn't vanish. They migrated slowly westward, mixing with Iranian populations, Turkic tribes, and Caucasian steppe groups along the way. Over generations, their genetic profile transformed. But a handful of elite families, royal bloodlines, survived the journey intact. The journey from Mongolia to Hungary didn't take months. It took generations. But here's the tragic part. Only the elite families survived the migration with their identity intact. The rest? Their identity dissolved into the steppe, absorbed into the populations they encountered. By the time they reached Europe, the Huns were genetically unrecognizable from their Xiongnu ancestors. One ritual survived the 300-year migration, a practice so extreme Romans called them monstrous. Artificial cranial deformation, the deliberate reshaping of infant skulls. Between 50 and 80% of all Hun period burials in the Carpathian Basin show evidence of this practice. Parents would bind their babies' heads between wooden boards or wrap them tightly in cloth, applying constant pressure for months. The result? Elongated skulls that stretch toward the back of the head. To modernize, it looks bizarre. See, to Romans like Ammianus Marcellinus, who encountered the Huns in the 4th century, it looked terrifying. He described them as so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be 2-legged animals. But this wasn't biology, it was culture. Archaeological evidence shows the practice originated in the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia around the 2nd century BCE, exactly where Xiongnu groups are known to have migrated after conflicts with Han China. Here's what's crucial. There's no evidence of skull deformation among Xiongnu populations in Mongolia itself, which means the Huns adopted this practice after moving west, likely from interactions with populations in modern-day Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. But why do it? What was the point? According to scholar Hyunjin Kim, the goal was to create a clear physical distinction between nobility and commoners. It was a visible, permanent marker of elite status. Others, like archaeologist Suzanne Hakenbeck, argue it was about kinship, a way to mark family lineages and distinguish one clan from another. Either way, skull deformation became the visual identity of Hun elites. Even as their genetics mixed with European, Iranian, and other populations, this practice kept them recognizable. The woman from the first segment, the one buried in Pusztatasconi, Hungary, with gold earrings, had an elongated skull, and her DNA proved she descended from Xiongnu elite. Her skull told the truth that her genes had almost erased. They couldn't keep their blood pure, but they could keep their skulls recognizable. And one grave revealed the most shocking secret of all. a Hun queen who had zero Asian blood. She was buried like royalty, gold jewelry, ceremonial placement, warrior offerings surrounding her body. Everything about the burial screamed Hun nobility. But her DNA told a completely different story. When researchers analyzed her genome, they found 100% Eastern European ancestry, 0 Central Asian markers, 0 East Asian heritage, nothing that connected her genetically to the steppes. She wasn't a captive. Captives don't get buried with gold. They don't get ceremonial honors. They don't get placed in elite cemeteries. She was Hun nobility, a woman who married into the ruling class. And her presence in that grave reveals the Huns' most dangerous strategy. They didn't conquer through genocide. They conquered through integration. See, the Huns absorbed local European elites into their confederation through strategic marriage alliances. European aristocratic women married Hun chieftains, bringing political legitimacy, local knowledge, and regional alliances. This wasn't unique to the Huns. Genetic studies of the Xiongnu Empire show that elite women played critical roles in alliance building. Marriage wasn't just personal, it was political infrastructure. But here's where it gets complicated. Every time a Hun leader married a European woman, every time their children inherited mixed ancestry, the genetic identity of Hun diluted further. Within 2 or 3 generations, the descendants of these marriages looked genetically European. The Huns didn't destroy Europe's elite, they married them. And that's what destroyed the Huns. Because when your empire's identity is based on being the terrifying outsiders from the East, what happens when your children look like Europeans? When your grandchildren speak Latin as fluently as they speak Hunnic? When your DNA is indistinguishable from the people you conquered, you cease to exist. By the time Attila died in 453 CE, the Hun Empire was genetically unrecognizable. Dr. Zuzana Hoffmanova from the Max Planck Institute analyzed the broader population data from Hun period Europe. Her conclusion was stark. Although the Huns dramatically reshaped the political landscape, their actual genetic footprint, outside of certain elite burials, remains limited. Most people living in Hun-controlled territories during the 5th century showed predominantly European ancestry with only minor steppe influence, and the genetic impact was superficial. The Hun Confederation held together through fear, military dominance, and one man's charisma, Attila. When Attila died suddenly in 453, possibly from a nosebleed on his wedding night, the empire shattered within 5 years. The subject tribes, Goths, Gepids, Lombards, Burgundians, Rugians, immediately returned to their original ethnic identities. The political alliance called Hun dissolved overnight. By 500 CE, less than 50 years after Attila's death, the word Hun ceased to refer to any living people. But here's the twist. The Huns didn't leave Europe. They became Europeans. Their descendants married into Germanic tribes, Slavic populations, and Roman remnants. Within 2 generations, there was no genetic distinction. The conquerors had been genetically absorbed by the conquered. The greatest empire in European history disappeared not through military defeat, but through genetic dilution. The Huns didn't leave, they just stopped being Huns. But their DNA didn't vanish. It hid, and 1,500 years later, scientists found it in the last place anyone expected. Modern genetic surveys have revealed something extraordinary. Between 3 and 7% of modern Hungarians, Germans, Romanians, and Ukrainians carry genetic markers that match Hun-era steppe samples. A 2022 study by Marotti and colleagues analyzed Y chromosome haplogroups, genetic markers passed from father to son. They found haplogroups Q1A2, R1A-, Z93, and N-M46 in modern Central European populations. These exact same haplogroups appear in both Xiongnu elite burials and Hun period graves. These aren't pure Hun descendants. That's genetically impossible given the mixing patterns we've discussed, but they are genetic echoes, fragments of DNA that survived 1,500 years of intermarriage and population movement. Cultural remnants persist too. The Hungarian language is Uralic, part of a language family that includes Finnish and Estonian, completely unrelated to the Indo-European languages spoken by Hungary's neighbors. Some linguists argue this reflects deep cultural connections to the Ural Mountains region, potentially linked to steppe migrations. Certain Hungarian burial customs, folklore traditions, and even folk dances show possible connections to ancient nomadic practices. In one Hungarian village, locals perform a ritual dance every spring that historians believe may have originated with steppe nomads, performed continuously for approximately 1,500 years. The Huns are gone, but their genes are still here, hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of modern Europe. And then, in 2021, archaeologists found something impossible: a Hun warrior. In England, southern England, 2021, a construction crew preparing to build new housing uncovers a 5th century grave. The burial orientation was unusual, north-south, matching steppe traditions rather than Christian or Roman practices. The grave goods were even stranger: weapons designed for horse-mounted warfare, artifacts with clear Central Asian stylistic influences, and the skull showed signs of artificial deformation. When DNA analysis was completed, the results were unmistakable: Central Asian genetic markers matching Hun period samples from Hungary. This man died 1,500 miles from Attila's empire in a region the Huns never officially controlled. But he was genetically Hun. The evidence suggests that after the Hun Confederation collapsed in the 400s and 50s, small groups of warriors scattered across Europe, selling their military skills as mercenaries. The composite bow technology the Huns had perfected was devastatingly effective. Post-Roman warlords, Gothic kings, and petty chieftains would have paid handsomely for warriors who knew how to use it. This man's grave goods tell his story: a Roman coin, a Germanic brooch, and steppe-style weapons. A man caught between 3 worlds, serving masters who once feared his ancestors. He fought for people who saw him as the enemy. He died among strangers. And 1,600 years later, his bones revealed a secret no history book mentioned. The Huns didn't just conquer and vanish. They scattered across Europe as soldiers for hire, leaving genetic traces in places they never ruled. Which raises the final question: if the Huns were never really the Huns, what were they? After analyzing 370 genomes spanning 800 years, scientists faced one undeniable truth: the Huns were a political identity, not an ethnic one. Dr. Walter Pohl from the Austrian Academy of Sciences studies how political entities form and dissolve. His analysis of the Hun Empire is devastating. The ancestors of Attila's Huns took many generations on their way westward and mixed with populations across Eurasia. What unified them wasn't blood, it was military innovation. The composite bow, a weapon made from wood, sinew, and horn that could pierce Roman armor at 200 yards. Horse-mounted warfare tactics that allowed rapid strikes and retreats, and terror-based diplomacy that made surrender seem preferable to resistance. They created something unprecedented: the first superculture, a political entity that transcended ethnicity, religion, and language. You didn't have to be born Hun to become Hun. You joined through military service, marriage alliances, or political submission. The identity was earned, not inherited. This model would be replicated by later empires. The Mongols used identical strategies 800 years later, multi-ethnic confederations held together by military dominance and political structure rather than shared ancestry. But the Huns paid the ultimate price for this strategy. When the political structure collapsed, when Attila died and the military machine faltered, the identity vanished instantly. Because there was nothing underneath, no shared language, on no common religion, no genetic unity. Johannes Krause summarized it perfectly. The study underscores how cutting-edge genetic research can resolve centuries-old debates about the composition and origin of past populations. Modern nationalist movements love to claim pure ancestry and ancient bloodlines. The Huns prove that's a lie. No empire in human history has ever been genetically pure. Every conqueror is eventually conquered by the DNA of those they ruled. They were everyone. They were no one. And that's what made them the most terrifying force in history. And somewhere in the steppes of Kazakhstan, archaeologists are digging up the next chapter. In 2024, ground-penetrating radar detected something in the Altai Mountains near the Kazakhstan-Mongolia border. Burial mounds, dozens of them, unexcavated, undating to the 2nd through 4th centuries CE, exactly the period when Xiongnu populations were migrating westward. Modern DNA extraction technology has advanced dramatically. Scientists can now retrieve usable genomes from bones that would have been considered too degraded even 5 years ago. The 2025 study answered critical questions about Hun origins, but it opened bigger mysteries. Were there other elite families that made the journey west, but left no trace? Did the Huns speak Yeniseian languages, as some recent linguistic studies suggest? What happened to the Xiongnu groups that didn't migrate to Europe? Right now, in laboratories across Germany, Hungary, and Kazakhstan, researchers are preparing to analyze newly discovered remains. The next study could reveal Hun populations we never knew existed. It could find genetic links to regions we haven't considered. It could rewrite the story again. In a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, a technician carefully extracts DNA from a newly discovered skeleton. The sample goes into a sequencing machine. Hours later, the computer screen flickers with preliminary results. Genetic match, Xiongnu elite, approximately 150 CE, and secondary markers, unknown European population. The Huns rewrote history once. Their bones are about to do it again.